Good evening. Hi. Welcome to Getting Started with Infrastructure as Code for SAP. My name is Chris Kernan. Thank you for joining in. This is the second after last week. We had a trial run last week, which was a lot of fun. So it was some interesting learnings from that. But what I wanted to do this evening was go through some of the things that we went through last week, some of the stuff that didn't work, and then talk about some new stuff related to Ansible and what the art of the possible is with that. Okay, so got a couple more people coming online. So let's get started. So basically, last week what we did was we talked about, or rather I talked about and people sent me comments, was around the what is infrastructure as code, okay? And really what it comes down to is the fact that anything that you define in code in order to create an infrastructure object, that could be a VM, that could be a Docker container, that could be any number of things, okay? And how I got started with this was my home lab always seemed to need something done to it, and it was a bit of a pain. So I was always trying to find the best way to do something in code in order to make that process really, really short. Okay, so I started in Hyper-V, and in Hyper-V, what we tried to do was set up the system. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to run through a very, very quick Powershell script and show you, really what infrastructure as code really actually means. Doesn't mean really, really complicated reams of code. This is a simple Powershell script that creates a VM of CentOS 8. So let me switch over to my desktop. Give me a second. Screen share. There we go. So you can see my desktop here. Okay. So I'm going to drag over my Hyper-V. So you can see I don't have anything. I've got one VM which is stopped at the moment. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring up the PowerShell script. Okay. So this PowerShell script is pretty simple. It takes a couple of variables. So it does. So my VM name, my image, the VM switch that I'm using, how many CPUs I want to give it, how much RAM I want to give it, the path to where I wanted to put the Hyper-V disk, and then that disk size. Okay. So this is what we define here. Okay, and then these are the actual PowerShell commands. Create a new VM with VM name, set up the parameters for the VM, the processor, RAM, the disk, and then actually set the VM drive, connect the VMware adapter, and then actually start that. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to launch into, so I'm using the Windows terminal here. Okay, find it very, very useful. Okay, it's got a nice tab design. You can put your own. You can add additional things to it. You can SSH directly to boxes. You could create other. You can put it out to Azure or to Google or wherever. Okay, but here we're just doing a administrator PowerShell command. So I'm going to do an ls. So I can see here I have VM create, which is what I have here. So I'm going to run that. Always do the backslash the wrong way. Okay. So I'm going to run this, and with any luck, so it's creating the hard drive, then it's actually starting the VM, and then what it'll do is it'll actually start to, so if you look here, if I overlay this with this, we can actually see the new VM starting. Okay. And then it's now started, so I now have the properties of it. I can see that it's running. I can see that it has 8 gig of RAM. Okay, and if I actually connect into it. Sorry, let me try. That's come up in the wrong window. There we go. There it is there. It's actually started. Okay, so now I can actually start to install CentOS. So I can. And that is a really, really simple example of infrastructure as code. Okay, taking a script and actually turning it into an infrastructure object. Okay, so I'm going to power this down because we don't actually need that. This was just the example of how do you actually get started in infrastructure as code. Okay, the next thing I actually wanted to talk about was, what leads on from that is, how do we actually make that script useful? Okay, because that's fine when I'm using it. Okay, but how do I actually make that usable and more shareable across people? And as we talked about last week, we actually use Git for that. So what I've done is that actually sits in a GitHub folder in my machine, and it's under a folder called Hyper-V create. Okay, now I have a GitHub repository. I'm just going to open up the repo. Project directories. Open a repository. So I actually have a GitHub repo for this. Okay. And what you can see here is, with Git is a version control system. Okay, there are lots and lots of YouTube videos on Git and why it's useful, why it's good, why you need to be using this, and especially as a systems admin, throughout a lot of my career, folks had some amazing scripts and things like that, but a lot of people didn't trust other people's scripts, if you will. So what ended up happening with people just ended up writing a lot of their the same stuff. Okay, so what the reason why I like Git is we it's a version control repository. I can fork your code, or you can fork my code, or you can contribute to my code, and we can do it in a proper version controlled manner. Okay, now what you can see here is this is a graphical client I use called Git Kraken, or you can use Gmaster, or you can use the command line. One of the things that I find is that when I got started initially, the command line is actually quite daunting, and there are lots and lots of different commands. One of the reasons why I like Git Kraken or the visual Git clients is the fact that I can see very clearly branching and code overtakes and that sort of thing, and that makes it very, very useful for me. Okay, so as you can see here, I have a timeline of the repository from initial commit through to what I've been doing. Okay, then on here I can see the changes. So what happens is there is a directory within the repo, and it actually shows, or it actually tracks everything that happens in the actual directory. So when you update files and things like that, it'll tell you. Okay, so when I look here, what I can show is I can show this VM create, and what I can do is I can actually see the changes that I've made. So here, for example, I have changed the image and the VM switch. I've also removed a number of lines here. So I have. So if I'm happy with this, what I can do is stage the change and remove the VLAN and the NIC definition. It would help if I could type definition from the script. Okay, so then I commit the changes. Okay, now that's just committed on my side. What I want to do is I actually want to push that so that it is reflected in the actual repository. Okay, now when I actually open a GitHub here. So if I go to GitHub, no, actually, do you know what? I'm going to do it on this one. If I go to github.com, so you can see here, this is the last commit. Okay, so I committed this 28 seconds ago, or a little longer now, and you can see the last one was remove the VLAN and nick definition from the script, and you can see all the things now. As I said, someone can fork this. So, for example, Paul, you could fork this and actually use it on your internal home lab, or somebody else can. Okay, so that was the example that we had there, and using Hyper-V and also Git Kraken. Okay. Another thing I wanted to show was there were a number of people who talked about what was the editor I was using, and what extensions I was using and things like that. So I'm just using Visual Code. Okay, Visual Code is phenomenal editor. I use it across all my projects and things like that, and I have it set up so that it will actually replicate no matter what machine I'm on, all the settings across. So quite simply, the extensions that I'm using the ABAP extension, I'm using the Ansible and Ansible Autocomplete, Bash Beautify, which is a brilliant one, bracket pair colorizer, very, very handy, so you don't end up without closing up your brackets. Code Sync, that one's a good one as well. And then Docker and Docker Explorer. ESLint is very, very important. That gives you all your linting for your JavaScript. GitHub and Gist are very useful as well. I've got Terraform in here. That means that I can actually, it will actually do the Terraform auto completion and IntelliSense. There's another good one here. Where is it? PowerShell is very good. Print code, because apparently you can't print from Visual Studio Code. That's very frustrating. And then I've got the SAP HANA driver. Settings sync. So this allows me to actually to use a GitHub gist to store the JSON for Visual Studio Code, and it means that no matter what machine I go to, if I use my gist, then I can actually do this. Okay, so that's really the tool, the main tool that I'm using. So what I'm going to do now is, one of the that's enough of a recap. What I also want to talk about now is getting down and dirty with something like Ansible. Okay, so I spend a lot of my time at the moment automating stuff using Ansible. Okay, and to be honest with you, actually the SAP part of it is very, very simple. That doesn't take an awful lot, to get working. The infrastructure as code is actually getting the Ansible and the Terraform to work. Okay, so next week we'll or the next one we'll have a look at Terraform. But what I wanted to talk about now was actually Ansible, because it's the one that is the source for everything that I'm doing at the moment. So with Ansible, I can call Bash, I can call PowerShell, I can call the Terraform as well. Okay, so let's have a look at some Ansible. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to set up a Raspberry Pi. Okay, and do stuff with a Raspberry Pi. So what we're going to do is I'm going to show you some code that I have for Ansible. Okay, now let me just explain this directory structure, because this is actually quite important. Okay, so with Ansible you have a at the lowest level you have what is known as a task. Okay, so if you look here, you can see I have a task called main.yaml. Okay, now Ansible uses YAML. Okay, YAML is a markup language. It's relatively simple, so it is, and it is declarative in nature. And what I mean by that is you declare what you want the end state actually to look like. Okay, so when you look at this example here, for example, what I've highlighted is name. So I'm going to create a .ssh directory. Okay, and that path for that directory is going to be /home/pi/.ssh. Okay, the state is it's a directory. Now the options could be directory or file. So if I take this, if I highlight this, what you can see is you've actually got the IntelliSense telling you that you can either have default as file. So if it's absent, so what you can say is it's either a directory or it's a file. Okay, the state is either absent or directory or file. If it's absent, what it'll do is it'll actually remove what you've defined in the path. Okay, if you state it's a directory, then it'll create the directory. If it's a file, it'll create the file for you. Okay, and then I can also set the mode, the directory permissions. Okay, and this is one of the reasons why I really like Visual Studio Code, because there's a thing, because it's YAML and because the whole product is based on Python, it is really, really, really sensitive to linting or positions of characters and spaces and tabs and things like that. So if, for example, I delete these, this should come back with an issue saying that it doesn't like the directory, it doesn't like this. What it wants is it wants to have the quotes around it. Oh, they've actually fixed that. In the previous version of the Ansible linting thing, it used to drive me absolutely bananas. So they fixed that. But yeah, so what you can see here, for example, is value not accepted because technically it's violating the linting and the code completion. Okay. Oh, excuse me. Right. So what we'll do is, so as I said, so you start with a task, okay? And then you can have multiple tasks in a rule, okay? So it's tasks at the lowest level, then you have a rule, and you can have multiple rules. So when you look here, I have 3 rules. I have a host setup, I have a tools install, and I have a tools setup. Okay? And in here, for example, I have a tool install, which has a task, which installs Docker. Okay? Or I can have tasks in here to do things like configure Prometheus, or install the Prometheus exporter. Okay? And then what we can do is we can have a main function which will actually import the tasks. Okay. Now, the next level up is either a collection or a playbook. Okay. Now collections are interesting because they actually function like plugins. So they do. I haven't really got my head around it entirely because I'm not using them at the moment. I probably will use them at some point in the next wee while, when it comes to the next release of my code at work. But at the moment, I haven't really got my head around collections, so I'm still using playbooks. Okay, so for this, we'll talk about playbooks. Okay, so when I have a playbook. So let's say, for example, playbook. Okay. So what I'm doing is this is an Ansible playbook for configuring a Raspberry Pi. I give it the hosts. Okay. Now that comes from an inventory. Okay. Now this inventory here is again a YAML file, and this shows what the what each of these nodes actually looks like. Okay, so I can set these into groups. So what I've done is I've done things like Docker Lab. Okay, so that has a host of my NUC, my Raspberry Pi 4 with 4 gig of RAM, and then my Raspberry Pi 4 of 8 gig of RAM. When I look at my Kubernetes lab, okay, so the Raspberry Pi flavor of Kubernetes is K3S. It's lighter than K8. And in that I have Raspberry Pi K8.1, K8.2, K8.3, K8.4. Okay, and I'm giving the IP address for each of those. Sorry, I just needed a drink. Okay, so this is the inventory file. So the playbook references a host that is defined within the inventory file. Okay. What I'm then doing is giving it the rule that I want it to use. Now that could be one rule, that could be many rules. So when you look here, for example, I have a different playbook and I've got 2 rules. Okay. So then what we do is we then set the remote user. Okay. And we're going to set that to pi. And then we're going to say become yes. Okay. Now become is effectively sudo. Okay. So what we're saying is within the rule, we're saying that there are elements in this rule that require sudo privileges. Okay. And you can set that up at a task level as well. Okay. So that's the playbook. That's how you structure an Ansible playbook at a really, really basic and simplistic level. Okay, there are other things in here like variable files, like molecule test files, and things like that. And it all gets a little bit complicated. But at its absolute basic nature, okay, you have a task which sits inside a rule, and the rule can be called by a playbook. Okay, so let's have a look and see the actual task itself. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at the task to set up a Raspberry Pi. Okay, and as I said, this doesn't seem like it is related to SAP in this way. What I'm going to show you here is actually very, very relevant to SAP. In the last year, for what we've actually set up for infrastructure as code, when I look at the amount of code that I've written in Ansible to install an SAP system, okay, to build the infrastructure, build the network, build the firewall rules, create the disks, do the OS, then create the NFS, put all the media on it, and then configure the operating system. Really, when it comes down to it, to install SAP was a single command, okay, but there was a considerable amount of effort and code to set everything up to get to that point. Okay, and yes, you actually use an awful lot of the same constructors in this. Okay, so when I look back at all the things that I used in order to do this, okay, file, this one here, file, for example, is an absolute critical one. Okay, when I look at how to line in file where I'm updating contents of files, that's another one. And then you have shell and that sort of thing. It actually does, you do end up using a lot of the same code. Okay, it's not actually all that complicated, and the Ansible documentation is phenomenal. It is really, really good. Okay, so when I step through this, okay, so what we're assuming is we are starting with a Raspberry Pi, okay? Just a blank operating system on it, and we're going to start from nothing, okay? And so what we need to do is we need to actually to SSH to that, because Ansible, when it's doing stuff, uses SSH, okay? And that's one of the reasons why it's really, really good on Linux machines and Unix machines. It's not quite so good with Windows machines. Getting it to work on Windows, you need to use the WinRM, and that's just a nightmare. That really is just a pig to get working. So it is. It is very, very, very challenging to get working. So yeah. So let's look at the next bit. So what we're doing is we're creating a .ssh directory, because when we initially log in, we're going to use a password, okay? And then what we're going to do is we're going to set up the SSH key so we never need to use the password again, okay? So what we'll do is we create the SSH directory, okay? We're going to create an authorized keys file, okay? We're going to set the right privileges to it, and what we're going to do is we're going to take the ID RSA pub, okay, so the public key, and we're going to put it into that authorized key file, okay? Then we're going to set the permissions on that file, set the directory permissions on the SSH directory, okay? Then what we're going to do is we're going to update the host name, okay? Because when you first install a Raspberry Pi, its default host name is raspberry_pi. I'm going to change the host name to something else, okay? Then what we're going to do is we're going to replace the Raspberry Pi host name. So what's going to happen is we're going to replace Raspberry Pi in the host file, give it the path, so etc hosts, look for Raspberry Pi, and then replace it with the Raspberry Pi host name, okay? Now that is a variable. Okay, so this is what a variable looks like in Ansible. It's got the curly brackets, okay? And when you go into a file here, so what I have is I've defined all these variables, okay? So this makes the script actually more portable, okay? Because when I take this, I can use this on any Raspberry Pi. What I need to do is update the variables that are actually in here, okay? So so this is the host name that I'm going to change my Raspberry Pi to. So I'm going to change it from this to this, okay? Then what I've done is I've set the wireless LAN IP address to 2200, and I'm setting the Ethernet IP address to 122. The gateway, I'm setting it to static, and then the DNS servers, okay, so I'm setting it to search itself, its own cache, then to look at my DNS server, and then to go to Google's DNS server, okay, right? So these are the variables that I've set up that are being called in this script, okay? So I've commented out the updating the packages because I want to do this here. I don't really want to do it. That'll take a little bit of time, and then what we then do is check to see if the file has already been updated. Okay, so this is the DHCP file. Okay, so if the file already has the Ethernet address in it, then it doesn't, we don't want it to do anything. Okay, if it hasn't got anything in it, then what we're going to do is we're going to set up the DHCP. Okay, so as you can see here, what I'm doing is I'm inserting a static address. So what I'm going to do is I'm adding the interface for the wireless LAN, adding the static IP address for the wireless LAN, the static router, and then setting the DNS system. Okay, so you can see all these things are hopefully going to work. Okay, so this is what we have at the moment. Okay, so this is taking a Raspberry Pi and configuring it. Now, how do we actually get the Raspberry Pi to this point? Okay, so one of the things that I also got frustrated with was creating the actual Raspberry Pi itself. You know, the code, because you can network boot a Raspberry Pi, or you can boot it from USB, or you can boot it from an SD card. So one of the things that I got bored doing over Christmas was having to download the software, write it to an SD card, and then put the SD card in, and then have to configure it. Okay, so what I did was I actually again wrote a PowerShell script where that would actually do it for me. So what I'm doing is I'm using a thing called Etcher to flash a USB stick. It'll tell me that it's actually created, and then what I copy is I copy the wireless LAN configuration to the SD card. Then I enable SSH by creating an empty file with SSH in it. I then take the file called commandline.txt, which I'll show you just now. So when you look here, boot, here we go. So command line. So when you look here, what you can see is this is one that I've already updated. So you see all this code here, and then what I do is I actually drop in here the IP address of the actual box, the Raspberry Pi. Okay, so when you go back into the variables, you can see the Ethernet address here, and that now links to the inventory where you can see here RV Raspberry Pi 442. So that's Raspberry Pi 4 gig of RAM, Raspberry Pi number 2. Okay, so you can see here. Okay, so what I can do is I can run this. Okay. Just want to make sure if anybody can see the terminal okay. Or do you need it bigger? It's one of those things you never quite know how big you need the terminal. Right, so while I'm waiting on that, yep, looks fine. Cool. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I am going to run this, so Ansible playbook. Do you know what? I've run this that often. No, not on this machine. Okay, so Ansible dash playbook. Playbook. Okay, so this is the actual command here because I'm going to run the playbook. Okay, so this is where it all looks really, really complicated. Okay, but there's only a couple of things that I'm actually interested in. Okay, so what I'm interested in is things like the extra vars, because that's the variables that we're actually going to use. The inventory, which gives us how to address the actual server, and then verbose. Okay, so and also remote user. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. Okay, so we're going to go Ansible playbook space minus I and the inventory file. So it is in this directory, isn't it? Pi, yep. So it's inventory.yaml. Okay, so we're going to give this, and that is all.yaml. Okay, so this is the variable file that we're going to use. And then I need to give it the remote user is going to be pi, and then I need to give it the playbook, I think it's host set, and then I'm going to ask it to increase the verbosity. Okay, hopefully I've got this right. If not, it'll tell me fairly quickly. So let's hit return. Okay, so here it is, it's running. So it's gathering facts. So it's creating the SSH directory. Okay. It's added in the line. It's created the directory permissions. It's set the host name. Okay. It's checked to see if the file has been updated. So what you can see is it's added the line. Okay. And then it's made those changes. So let's SSH to the machine. Hold on a second. Just need to double check and see where my okay, good. SSH shouldn't have done that. I should have actually been able to log in. Oh, that would help. Sorry. It helps you log in as the right user. I think it's that. And also, why is this started acting up? SSH. Oh. I think that's right. Ah, there it is. Okay. The reason why is simply just because I hadn't changed the user. I was trying to log in as Boo Boo, and the didn't like that. Okay. So now, when we look at so sudo more etc dhcp cd.conf, what you can see is where it's actually added the block, which is what we asked it to do. Okay, so now what this is doing is this will actually show that it has the static IP, it has the router, it has the domain name servers, everything that we asked it to do, it's got in there. Okay. Similarly, when you look at the when you look at this directory, you can see here that the authorized key file was updated a couple of minutes ago. Okay, so what we've actually done is we've taken a plain Raspberry Pi and updated it with the with what we want. Now, what we can do as well is we can now actually start to layer software over the top of that, because that's just configuring the base OS. Let's actually try and do something a little bit more exciting. So for example, what we can do is we could install Docker on this machine. Okay, so let's actually add a couple of tasks to this where we can install Docker. So name install Docker. Okay, so what we're going to do is we need to work out what it is we actually need to do to install Docker. Okay, so when we look at just jump into this, so install Docker Ansible. Okay, so that's the wrong link. I want to actually use, where's Docker? There we go. So what we're going to do is, so we can use pip to install Docker, so we can, or we can actually download it from our thing. But if we use pip, what means is we then need to install it from the shell. So Ansible using pip. So what we can do actually is we can actually use pip here to do the install. So when you look here is, so install the bottle Python package. Okay, so this is what I mean when I actually mean that the Ansible documentation is really, really good. It gives you a lot here. Okay, and also when you don't know exactly what it is, how the best way to do something is, generally just Googling will get you quite far. The Ansible ecosystem is actually really, really mature. So that is, it's got a lot of very, very good information, a lot of very, very experienced guys, or people working in there. In fact, when I do this, this gentleman here is probably one of the best guys to look at. His name is Jeff Geerling, and he's on Instagram, he's on Twitter, he's on the Ansible forums. He is just absolutely amazing, and I've learned so much from this guy. Really, really good. His YouTube videos are absolutely phenomenal. He does an Ansible 101, so he does YouTube streaming series. Would highly recommend people go and check this out. Okay. Anyway, getting back to it. So what we can do is we can actually use the pip module to install Docker. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this. Okay, and I'm going to add this to my code. So here we go. Okay, so I'm going to take this and have a look. Okay, so save this. Okay, so I'm not getting any linting issues. If I were to sort of do this, you'll see that the YAML schema is wrong. So I need to put the space in, and it disappears. Okay. So now that I've got this, I'm going to save it. I'm going to go back into my repo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open my Raspberry Pi config. So here you can see the change. So I've set it up here, and I've added this install Docker. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stage all the changes. I'm going to put added the pip install for Docker. Okay, commit the change and push it. Okay, and then what we're going to do is I'm now going to exit from this and I'm going to rerun the playbook. Okay, and this is now going to install Docker. Now this is something else, hopefully. Something else is actually really important. There's a concept of idempotency. Idempotency, however you pronounce it, because there are many different ways, actually states that I should be able to run this playbook again and again and again and again. And it'll make a change when it's necessary and ignore something when it isn't. Okay, now that's just install Docker. Okay, so what I can do is I can go back and I can SSH into the box and run sudo docker. No, it didn't install Docker. It said that it did. Interesting. Okay, so it's downloaded it. Did I need to use pip3 or pip? No, it's got both. Yeah, interesting. See, this is why I enjoy this. So we didn't get any errors. We can try it again. Did install on this box. Now, we just have a. Nowadays, it's using Raspberry 442. So use Python 3. Okay, so it's running through. It's setting the IP. Well, it's checking the IP addresses again. So when you see changed, it actually does something. When you see OK, it's not actually doing anything. Now, this says OK. It's using pip2. It should really be using pip3, and I think that might actually be the problem. It says requirements already satisfied. Requirements already satisfied, already satisfied, already satisfied. So really, I don't see why. No, it's not doing it now. I do have another thing here where I actually do an install. So one of the things that I also do is I thought this might happen, so I wrote another one. So here, let me just add this to this instead. Okay, so one of the things that I did before was actually go out to the shell, and from the shell I can actually download Docker, okay, and then I can install Docker using a script from the shell, and then start it as a service. Okay, so since the pip didn't work, what we're going to do is we're going to try this. Okay, so I've saved that. I'm going to view the change, stage it. I'm going to put removed pip command and replace with shell installation. Okay, so do that, push that. Okay, so I'm going to exit from the SSH. I'm going to rerun the playbook. Okay, so while it's doing that, we'll check and see if it's going to do it. So I'm also using Ansible for configuring things like automatic updates. I have a playbook that will automatically update all the packages and the OS, and that I can run these using a cron job periodically, or I can run them using GitHub Actions and things like that, and we'll go into GitHub Actions at some point. So so you'll see here it's actually downloaded the install script. It's complaining at me slightly because it wants me to use something other than curl, and then what we're doing is we're actually installing using the script. Now if I go into the thing here. No. No, I don't have it here. Let me just jump into it here. SSH pi at Hyper-V Raspberry Pi 442.local. File is, hopefully it should work. Oh, it'd help if I could spell Raspberry Pi 442. No. Well, there we go. Okay. So hopefully what we should see is did it finish? No, it finished. It took me that long to get in. Okay, so now I have Docker. Hopefully this should work. So if I do sudo docker, there we go. Docker is now installed. So what I've been able to do is actually install Docker, and what I can then do is actually use Ansible to control the Docker containers. Okay, so whatever Docker containers I wish to put into this, I can actually use Ansible to control those. Okay, there's a whole raft of controls that I can use for this. Okay, but that's not that's interesting. But the bit that we should be more interested in is how does this actually get us towards getting a a fully installed SAP system. Okay, and what that comes down to is how do we actually do the install? What is it we actually need? So if we were to break it down, in terms of Ansible, what you need to do is configure the OS. So that's things like users, disk and mount points. Okay. What else? Kernel parameters. Okay. Then feel free to add to the comments things we need to configure. Okay, so configure the OS, that's the users, disks, the mount points. Okay, then set up the media. Okay, so that's mount the NFS or download media. Okay, then we need to configure the parameter file. So we need to configure the parameter files for silent install. Okay. Configure that's actually a set of task. Set up the install application. Okay. So configure the parameter files for silent install. What else do we need to do? And then run the database rdbms install. Okay. And then run the silent install for SAP using SWPM. Okay, so when we look at this, these are the things that we need to do. Okay, so when we start to look at this, what we can actually do is break these down into playbooks. So at the top level, we can have a playbook here. Okay, and then this becomes well, you could do a playbook or you could do a rule. Let's say it's a rule. Okay, and then this is a task. Okay, and then this is a task. okay, and then this is a task, okay, because these things, you know, there is a general, I know we're running out of time, there is a general rule of thumb that the tasks shouldn't really be more than 100 lines, okay, simply because if your task is more than 100 lines, it means it's getting overly complicated, and you need to simplify it down. You can have as many tasks as you like within a role, okay, so it doesn't mean that you can't keep it nice and simple. Tasks and rules should be as sort of concise as a function, but as reusable as a library. Okay, and really, really powerful within that. So when you look at, for example, my task here, that's only 20 lines. When I look here, I'm getting into sort of 116 lines, but really I added this stuff around Docker just for the sake of convenience. It actually exists in a different rule. So if I delete this, I'm a less than 100 lines, and what I'm accomplishing in that is getting SSH access into the box, or setting the right SSH access, setting a host name, updating all the packages, and then setting up the wireless IP addresses and things like that. So there's stuff there. Okay, so now what we can do is we can set these up. Okay. Okay. And then that's really what it comes down to. Okay, so now what we can do is we can then build these rules and these tasks underneath it. All right, so that's us at the top of the hour. So that is, so thanks very much. We'll do this again in probably a week, maybe 2 weeks time. I'm still trying to work out what the schedule should look like. If you've got anything you want to leave in the comments, please do let me know. I'll put the links in for Jeff Geerling and his stuff. And so thanks very much for coming and hanging out and watching me play around with some code. Cheers. Bye. John, I'm using a Windows PC, but I'm using the Windows subsystem for Linux, so using Windows PC WSL. Any other questions? Nope. Excellent. All right, folks, again, thank you very much, and I will put up the next session and in a couple of days, and thanks very much. Bye.